Folklore February is just around the corner, and TBRs and piles of possibilities are being made for this month-long readathon where we explore folklore through stories. The 4 one-word prompts for this year are Flora, Fauna, Feast, and Famine. In today's video, I want to share the types of folklore stories related to each prompt, as well as some recommendations of stories that I think could work for these prompts. Welcome back, friends and fellow bibliophiles. And for those of you who are new to my channel, hi, I'm Kat, and I'm hosting Folklore February, which starts on Saturday, February 1st and ends on Friday, February 28th. As I mentioned in my announcement video, this is a flexible and fun reading event. All you have to do to participate is read one fairy tale, folk tale, fable, tall tale, myth, legend, or another genre that includes folklore elements. And keep in mind, these prompts are open to your interpretation. So let's dive into the types of folklore stories for each prompt and my recommendations. The first prompt is Flora, and there are 6 types of folklore stories related to Flora. And the first is tree folklore. Certain trees such as the oak, yew, or ash are often seen as sacred or magical in folklore. I found a website called AmericanForest.org that has an article called Sacred Roots, Trees in Folklore that I think would be very interesting. And then trees like hawthorns or elderberries are often associated with fairies or spirits. In British folklore, people believe that disturbing these trees could bring bad luck or anger the fairy folk. And I found an Irish folktale called The Fairy Tree of Dooros on a wonderful website called World of Tales at worldoftales.com. Number 2 is flower folklore. Flowers often symbolize different human emotions or states like love, grief, or renewal. In many cultures, flowers are connected to fairies and mythical creatures. The bluebell is associated with fairies in European folklore, and it's said that fairies use them to create music. Now, there is a Greek myth that I think that you would enjoy, and it is about Narcissus. This is a young man who falls in love with his own reflection in a river. The daffodil is named after him. Number 3 is herbal folklore. Many plants are thought to have magical or healing properties in folklore, and various plants are deeply intertwined with witchcraft and old magical practices such as moonwort, witch hazel, and mugwort, which are used in potions, spells, and rituals. Number 4 is nature spirits and plant guardians. In Greek mythology, dryads are tree spirits, with each tree type, oak, ash, pine, etc., having its own type of dryad. These spirits are often protectors of the forest, and their fates are linked with the health of the trees they inhabit. So in Greek mythology, there is a story about Eurydice, who is an oak dryad, who falls in love with Orpheus and his beautiful music. There's also a poem that can be found on poetryfoundation.org called Eurydice, and this is by H.D. In addition, there is a Celtic green man. The green man is a symbol of nature, often depicted as a face made of leaves and foliage, and he represents the spirit of the forest. And so there's several stories about the Celtic green man as well. Number 5 are transformation stories, specifically plant-based transformation myths. In many myths, humans are transformed into plants or trees as a result of a curse, punishment, or divine intervention. And one that you might enjoy reading is the Greek myth of Daphne, who transforms into a laurel tree to escape the advances of Apollo. And then number 6 is seasonal folklore. Flora plays a significant role in stories connected to the seasons. Spring is often personified by blooming flowers and rebirth, while autumn may be linked to harvest folklore and the shedding of leaves. In many traditions, plants symbolize the cyclical nature of life, death, and renewal. And one of my favorites is one that I taught my 7th graders one year, and it is the Greek myth of Demeter and Persephone, which is the story of the seasons. Here are a couple of books that I recommend for Flora, and the first one is Harvest Home by Thomas Tryon. This is what I would consider seasonal folklore. It's also folk horror. It's also showing reverence for nature. Highly recommend this book. If you like folk horror, I enjoyed it. It's a 5-star read for me. It is a slow burn, but it pays off in the end. And then the second one is Twistwood Tales by A.C. McDonald. This is a bunch of twisted fairy tales. It takes place in an enchanted forest. So you're looking at tree folklore, flower folklore, and it is in a comic book format, but very whimsical, a lot of fun. And then the next one is Pay the Piper by George Romero and Daniel Kraus. This is Kelsi at Slime and Slasher's book club selection for February. Her book club is called the Midnight Book Society. Everyone's welcome to join. I am putting this on my TBR. It takes place in a cursed Louisiana bayou, and I think it's going to be great fun. You know, I'm from Louisiana, but I think that the setting of it being in a bayou, that's going to also show us the flora of that environment. And then I have 2 books that I want to mention. These were mentioned in the comments of my announcement video or on the Discord by some friends of mine of what they're planning to read for Flora. And the first one is called Wayward by Amelia Hart. It's historical fiction. I think it might have some horror elements to it, but this would be considered witches and herbal folklore. This was selected by my friend Jen at Pages and Chaos. And then the next one would be considered flower folklore. It's a Beauty and the Beast retelling. It's called Bryony and Roses by T. Kingfisher, and Stina at Skeleton Key Books has chosen that to read for Flora. The second prompt is Fauna, and there are 8 types of folklore stories related to fauna, and the first is shape-shifting and transformation. In many cultures, animals are associated with shape-shifting abilities. A common theme in folklore involves humans transforming into animals or vice versa. In European folklore, wolves are frequently linked to werewolves, which are humans who can transform into wolves during a full moon. And also, humans or gods may transform into animals. For example, the story of Circe in Greek mythology, who turns Odysseus's men into pigs. So that's a perfect example. And then number 2 is trickster animals. Many cultures feature animals that play the role of a trickster, using their wit and intelligence to outsmart others. One of the most famous trickster animals is the fox, which appears in countless folklore traditions such as Native American, Russian, and European stories as a sly, clever creature. And then you have the raven in Native American stories, also often plays a trickster role, using mischief to teach lessons. I would also like to include the wolf, because stories like Little Red Riding Hood or The 3 Little Pigs also has a trickster wolf trying to get Little Red Riding Hood and his 3 little pigs. And you know what he wants to do with them? He wants to eat them. And then we also have Brer Rabbit. In African American folklore, Brer Rabbit is a well-known trickster character who uses his intelligence to outwit stronger, more powerful animals. Number 3 are sacred or symbolic animals. In some indigenous traditions, animals are viewed as totems, representing the spiritual essence of individuals or tribes. Certain animals are considered sacred or divine in various mythologies. In Hinduism, it's the cow. In Native American cultures, animals such as the eagle are considered spiritual guides. And we can't forget the ancient Egyptian culture where the cat was treated pretty special, which I have to agree, cats are awesome, and they happen to be my favorite animal. Number 4 are animals as guardians or protectors. In many myths, animals are seen as protectors or guardians. For example, the lion often represents strength and protection, appearing as the guardian of sacred spaces in numerous cultures. Some animals are believed to act as spiritual guardians. In Norse mythology, the wolves Fenrir and his offspring serve as symbols of power and fate, with their actions affecting the balance of the cosmos. Number 5 is magical or supernatural animals. Some animals in folklore are entirely mythical, possessing magical powers or divine characteristics. Creatures like unicorns, griffins, dragons, and phoenixes play a major role in folklore across cultures. Dragons, for example, symbolize power, wealth, and mystery in many Asian and European traditions. The swan is often associated with beauty, grace, and transformation in European folklore. They're considered divine birds. You might want to check out the Scandinavian story, The Six Swans. Number 6, animal spirits and ancestors. In some cultures, animals are seen as the spirits of ancestors or deceased loved ones guiding the living. And in some traditions, people believe in animal guides that offer wisdom or protection through one's life. These spiritual guides may appear in dreams, visions, or during rites of passage. Number 7, moral lessons and fables. My favorites. Animals often appear in fables, which are short stories meant to teach moral lessons. Classic examples come from Aesop's fables, such as The Tortoise and the Hare, where it's teaching the lesson or the value of perseverance. Then you have The Fox and the Grapes, which is illustrating the concept of cognitive dissonance. Also, animals represent human traits, both good and bad. For example, the ant in fables often represents hard work and diligence, while the grasshopper is portrayed as lazy or imprudent. And number 8, animals as emblems of change or transformation. Some cultures have stories where animals go through a process of renewal or rebirth, similar to a human transformation. The phoenix, a bird that burns itself and rises from its ashes, symbolizes immortality and resurrection in various mythologies. The phoenix also happens to be my one-word theme for 2025. And then in some traditions, animals embody the cyclical nature of life, death, and rebirth. For example, the snake or serpent often symbolizes regeneration, renewal, or the passage from one stage of life to another. And this year, in the lunar calendar year of 2025, it is the year of the snake, specifically the wood snake, which symbolizes wisdom, growth, and renewal. The snake has the ability to shed its skin, which shows transformation. Here are my recommendations for fauna. The first is The Folktale Cat, edited by Frank DeCaro. This would be for like magical or supernatural animals. Remember, European folklore, the witch is familiar. Or it could also be for sacred or symbolic animals, like the ancient Egyptian culture. You know, they love their cats. And then the next one, again, is Twistwood Tales by A.C. MacDonald. These little twisted folk tales, we have some animals that have human qualities or characteristics. And then I have The Cycle of the Werewolf by Stephen King. Absolutely love this book. This, of course, would be for shapeshifters. And then a fun one, The Werewolf of Fever Swamp. This is a Goosebumps book by R.L. Stine. Again, shape-shifting. Then we have one with a lion as a protector or guardian, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis, my favorite book in the whole entire world. Another cute little book, Kenny and the Dragon by Tony Diterlizzi. I always have problems pronouncing his last name, but this one is about a dragon. And then one that is nonfiction, but would be a lot of fun to read, is Dragonology, the complete book of dragons. Of course, because they are fantastical creatures. I love dragons. I have a lot of dragon books around my house because Andrew had a passion for dragons. He has passion for animals, but like he really loved dragons a lot. So what else? I have some, recommendations based on what some of my friends are reading. So Jen at Pages in Chaos is reading The Bear and the Nightingale by Catherine Arden. This would be like a transformation story. It could also probably count for Flora because there is a Leshy in it, which is a forest spirit. And then she is also reading, along with my friend Jellicle, The Fox Wife by Yangzi Chu. This has fairy tale elements in it. It's Asian mythology and folklore, especially concerning foxes. And then Travis, my friend Travis, is going to be reading Blackberry Fox by Catherine Tordazzi. It's a middle grade book. It is Welsh myths and legends, and it has a trickster animal in it. Prompt number 3 is feast, and before I share the types of folklore stories related to feasts, I'm going to share the meaning of feast in folklore. They are abundance and prosperity, community and togetherness, divine or supernatural blessing, temptation or moral testing, transformation and magic, reward and punishment. There are 6 types of folklore stories related to feasts, and the first one is feasts as celebrations or divine gifts. In Greek mythology, feasts were often associated with divine beings. The gods would host grand banquets on Mount Olympus to celebrate victories or special occasions. In Norse mythology, after warriors who died honorably in battle were taken to Valhalla, they were celebrated with an eternal feast hosted by Odin. Then number 2 is feasts as temptations. There's a classic fairy tale that you may enjoy rereading, and that is Hansel and Gretel. This story symbolizes the dangers of temptation and greed. And then you also have the story of the golden apples. This is in Greek mythology, and this highlights how feasts can lead to conflict, jealousy, and even war, specifically the Trojan War. Number 3 are feasts as tests or moral lessons. You might want to check out the Feast of the Three Brothers, which is in Celtic folklore. And this is about a feast that might serve as a test where the guests must demonstrate virtues such as generosity, loyalty, or wisdom. Failing the test might lead to a curse or punishment. You also might want to check out the story of the Fisher King, which is an Arthurian legend. And the Fisher King is often depicted as hosting a mystical feast, but only the pure of heart may partake in it. Number 4 are supernatural feasts. There are fairy feasts, and this is in many European folklore traditions. Fairies and other magical creatures are known to host feasts. And then also there is the wild hunt. In these traditions, it's led by a supernatural figure like Odin or a god of the hunt. May include a feast, but joining it could have grave consequences, such as being forced to participate in the hunt forever or being cursed by the gods. Number 5, feasts as symbolic transformation. And there's 2 stories that you might be interested in reading. The Swan Maiden, where a feast causes a transformation or a promise to be broken. It also leads to a magical emotional change. The other story is the tale of the 12 dancing princesses, where they partake in a magical feast and dance all night. Their adventures at the feast are key to their transformation and the resolution of the tale. And then number 6 are feasts as rewards or punishments. And there are 2, the Feast of the Dead. In Mexican Day of the Dead traditions, families prepare feasts to honor deceased ancestors. And then you have the Feast of the Gods. In some Native American and African cultures, feasts can mark rituals or rewards, where ancestors or spirits are fed through symbolic acts of sharing food. The feast represents the bond between humans and divine. And so some myths that you might be interested in reading that have to do with feast are Tantalus, Dionysus, the wedding of Peleus and Thetis. And as for fairy tales, you could try out The Strange Feast, Three Little Pigs, or Jack and the Beanstalk. A couple of books that I would recommend for feast are Harvest Home by Thomas Tryon, Based on the meaning of feast in folklore, this would represent community and togetherness, as well as abundance and prosperity. And then the Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. This is a retelling of the Iliad. And for this one, I would say it's because of divine or supernatural blessing. Achilles' mother Thetis blesses him. And then also moral testing because of Achilles and his pride. And then Pay the Piper by George Romero and Daniel Krauss. Because in this one, we're talking about hunger. There's a legend about a swamp entity that feeds on children. And prompt number 4 is famine. And before I share the types of folklore stories related to famine, I want to share the meanings of famine in folklore. And here they are. Punishment or divine wrath, moral or spiritual test, imbalance in nature, cycle of life, death, and renewal, scarcity, and greed. There are 6 types of folklore stories related to famine, and the first is famine as divine punishment. In the Bible, famine is often a punishment sent by God in response to sin. For example, in the Old Testament, the 7 years of famine in Egypt occur after Pharaoh's dream, which Joseph interprets as a warning of divine wrath due to imbalance in the land. The famine here serves as both a divine test and a corrective measure. In Norse myths, famine and scarcity are sometimes linked to the actions of gods or giants. So you might want to check out the story of Ragnarok, the end of the world. A great famine precedes the final battle, signifying chaos, destruction, and the breakdown of cosmic order. Number 2, famine as a test of virtue or resilience. You might enjoy the story, The Tale of the Boy and the Apple Tree. In this popular folk tale, a boy lives with his family in a land ravaged by famine. And then you also might enjoy reading or rereading the story of the prodigal son. While not strictly about famine, the story in Christian tradition of the prodigal son, which is in the Gospel of Luke, it involves a symbolic famine that causes the son to realize his mistakes, learn humility, and return to his father's house, representing the lessons learned from hardship and scarcity. Number 3 is famine as a result of imbalance with nature. Again, you could use the myth of Demeter and Persephone, which is in Greek mythology, and the famine on earth is caused by Demeter, the goddess of the harvest, who refuses to let the crops grow when her daughter Persephone is taken by Hades. So the famine symbolizes a natural cycle of life, death, and rebirth, where the earth becomes barren during Persephone's absence and blooms again when she returns. So again, it's that story of the seasons. And then you might also be interested in the story of the coyote and the starving people. In Native American folklore, the trickster god coyote sometimes causes famine as a punishment or test for humans. Number 4 is famine as a result of greed or selfishness. In some European folktales, a king's greed leads to famine in his kingdom. So you might want to read A Tale of a Greedy King. And also you might want to check out the story of The Fox and the Crow. And while it's not about a famine directly, this tale demonstrates a relationship between food, greed, and hunger. Number 5 is about famine as a catalyst for transformation. So you might want to check out The Legend of the Wendigo. The Wendigo is a mythical creature born of hunger and greed. The Wendigo represents the destructive power of famine when it leads to moral corruption and madness. You might also want to You might also want to check out the Fear Gorda, which is in Irish mythology. This is like a man or spirit that walks the earth during times of famine seeking alms by passers-by. And then also in Chinese folklore, famine and hunger are sometimes linked to the concept of the hungry ghost, a restless spirit that suffers from insatiable hunger due to improper burial rites or unfulfilled desires. And number 6, cultural or heroic folklore during times of famine. You have the Irish famine stories, which took place from 1845 to 1852. You have mythical figures like Saint Brigid, who is said to have performed miracles during times of great hardship. You also could use Hansel and Gretel for this because it was inspired by the Great Famine of the early 1300s, where people were literally starving. And then finally, stories of famine in folklore sometimes center around the idea of migration. So you might like stories about the Great Migration or folk tales of pioneers. Before I share my book recommendations for famine, I want to mention 3 fairy tales that would work well for this prompt. And they are Rapunzel, Cinderella, and Snow White. My first book recommendation is Nothing But Black and Teeth by Cassandra Khaw. This is Japanese folklore. There are yokai spirits in it, but I think it can count for The Hungry Ghost because there is a ghost bride that has a hungry heart. And then next is Devolution by Max Brooks. This has to do with famine in my mind because there's a natural disaster that causes the cryptid, the Sasquatch, to come into human territory. And of course, there's a massacre and situations. And that's basically because the natural disaster takes away the Sasquatch's food source. So, you know where this is going. And then The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller could work for this one as well. And I'm thinking it's because of the human greed or excess, also punishment and consequences, as well as survival and resilience. And a last book I want to mention is one that my friend Leslie at Books, Gurs, and Purrs just recently read, and it is called The Black Lord by Colin Hinckley. It is considered a new weird folk horror novel, and it is a fairy tale with emotional scarcity, and it is also a symbol of imbalance in the family. Next are my recommendations of books that I think could count for all 4 prompts, and the first is Slewfoot, A Tale of Bewitchery by Brahm. Second is Mythology, Oh My, Gods and Goddesses. The next book is my beautiful birthday book that I received from my friend Amy, and that is Nordic Tales, Folk Tales from Norway, Sweden, Finland, Iceland, and Denmark. Isn't that a beautiful cover? This is definitely going to be on my TBR for Folklore February. Another favorite is Snow and Rose by Emily Winfield Martin. Politically Correct Bedtime Stories. And also the sequel, Once Upon a More Enlightened Time. These are very, very silly. These are like fractured fairy tales in a way. Next is another collection, A Treasury of Norse Mythology, Stories of Intrigue, Trickery, Love, and Revenge. That's another beautiful cover. And then my Brothers Grimm fairy tales. Nice collection of fairy tales. Last year I read quite a few. And then the Harry Potter series. There's lots of mythology, so many different fantastical creatures. So it's not just the Sorcerer's Stone, but the whole entire Harry Potter series. And then also another little book called Adventures from the Land of Stories, The Mother Goose Diaries. And this is by Chris Colfer. This is kind of like a little companion book to the main stories, which are called The Land of Stories. There are numerous books in that series. It's actually a fantasy series, middle grade. It follows twins after they fall into a magical fairy tale book. And I was reminded of this series, which I think I've only read the first 3 books in the series, 3 or 4. I was reminded by Essie at the Novel Honey Shelf because she is thinking about reading some of the books in that series for Folklore February. My next set of books I'm recommending are all picture books. You know, I can't can't participate in a readathon without adding some picture books, but I'm going to show them to you and tell you where I think they would fit with the prompts. And the first is The Tale of Three Trees, a traditional folk tale retold by Angela Elwood Hunt. And this would count as Flora. The next one is Lan Popo, a Red Riding Hood story from China. This would count for Fauna as well as Feast. We have Nail Soup, a Swedish folktale retold by Harv Zemak, and this would count for Feast. One of my favorites, The Mitten by Jan Brett. This is a Ukrainian folktale, and this would count as Fauna. It's also a tale that teaches a lesson of friendship and kindness. Gallo and the Lion by Eric Oyono. This one would count for Feast as well as Fauna. A Cajun Little Red Riding Hood by Berth Amos. This one would also count for Fauna and Feast. It's another fairy tale about Little Red Riding Hood. Tortuga in Trouble by Anne Whitford Paul. This one would also count for Feast and Fauna because it is another Little Red Riding Hood retelling. The Three Billy Goats Gruff, retold by Mac Barnett. This would count for Fauna, and it's also the message to overcome a powerful adversary through cleverness. So you've got your little trickster animal in there. The Snow Queen, illustrated by Bagram Balut. It's Baltaline. This is based on Hans Christian Andersen's story. This one would count for Feast. The Fractured Fairy Tale, The Frog Prince Continued, story by John Sheshka. This one would count for Feast, Famine, as well as Flora. Then I have this cute one. It's called The Three Pigs by David Wisner. This is like a retelling of The Three Little Pigs, but this one I would count for Feast or Fauna. It's actually like a fable. There's a lesson to it, and the wolf is the one in this story that kind of gets tricked. Then Eric Carle's Dragons and Other Creatures That Never Were. This is a book of poetry, and I would count this for Fauna. Mythical Monsters, the Scariest Creatures from Legends, Books, and Movies. Some of the monsters in this book would count as Fauna, Feast, and Famine. So all three of those would count for this. And then I have another book that I got recently, a few months ago, called There's a Wolf at the Door, 5 Classic Tales Retold by Zoe B. Alley. And I think this one could count for more than one prompt. Definitely because of our wolf here, we're looking at Feast based on the tales, because let me see what the tales are. The Three Little Pigs, The Boy Who Cried Wolf, Little Red Riding Hood, The Wolf in Sheep's Clothing, and The Wolf and the 7 Little Goslings. So those are all the picture books that I would recommend for our prompts. Now, after sharing all of that information with you about the types of folklore stories for each of the prompts and giving you my recommendations for the prompts, I want to mention that you don't have to use the prompts in order to participate in Folklore February. They are for inspiration and for readers who like to have prompts for readathons. So there are plenty of stories out there that will fit Folklore February, that have folklore elements to it, plenty of fairy tales and folk tales and legends and myths and tall tales that you can enjoy throughout the month of February. In fact, I have a couple of recommendations I want to share with you and what categories they fit in under the folklore umbrella. So the first one is Stolen Tongues by Felix Blackwell. This has a Native American mythology in it. Then we have The Grimm Legacy by Polly Schulman. This has fairy tales by Brothers Grimm sprinkled throughout. It's a fun story, a fun middle grade story. And then Garlic and the Vampire by Bree Paulson, as well as Garlic and the Witch by Bree Paulson. Bree Paulson was somewhat inspired by Dracula for these two stories, although her version of her vampire is much nicer. And then a book that I have on my list is from the House of Shivers series by R.L. Stein, and it is called Goblin Monday. And of course, it includes goblins in it, which are these little creatures that are fantastical or mythical. And then one of my favorite books, Gnomes, which I started this last Folklore February, but I did not finish it. So I'll be diving back into this one as well. So I want to also mention a book that I don't have a physical copy of it because I borrowed it from the library, but I enjoyed it and I wanted to mention it. And that is The Salt Grows Heavy by Cassandra Caw. This is a Little Mermaid retelling. I will tell you though, to read the short story and In Our Daughters We Find Our Voice first. I didn't realize that The Salt Grows Heavy was a sequel to that short story. In the book that I borrowed from the library, the short story was at the back of the book, but of course I didn't discover that until after I read the story. Doesn't mean that it will take away from the enjoyment, but it does give you some more information that will make the novella more enjoyable. And as far as tall tales, you might want to check out John Henry, Pecos Bill, Paul Bunyan, Johnny Appleseed, Davy Crockett, or even Anansi the Spider. Those are just a few of tall tales that you might want to sprinkle in your reading for Folklore February as well. Well, friends, I hope this video has given you some more stories to add to your TBR or put in your pile of possibilities for Folklore February. I'm currently putting my pile together. There is an area on my Discord for Folklore February, and that's where I'll be posting what I'm reading throughout the month. You're invited to join the Discord. It's another place where you can find some more terrific recommendations, and you can also interact with a wonderful community. If you have any more recommendations for me or our friends, let me know in the comments below. I'd love to see what you're reading. As always, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you stopping by. And until our paths cross again, stay amazing and be adventurous.